You know, something interesting about the PSP that I've noticed is usually when it comes up in a topic of conversation, most people view it as a failure most times because it couldn't compete with the DS in terms of the units that the DS sold, and the DS kind of took over the handheld space there. It was all over the place, right? Pokemon and everything. But the PSP still managed to sell over 80 million units. In fact, this is the third best-selling handheld device, ever. That means that it outsold the Game Boy Advance, and it also outsold the 3DS. So it's behind the DS and the Game Boy, but it's still the third best-selling one. In fact, looking at this system, I actually think it was pretty well ahead of its time for what it was trying to do, which was be a full multimedia home console device in your pocket. So today, let's take a look at the PlayStation Portable, where it came from, and why I think it's actually well ahead of its time.
The PlayStation Portable was announced in 2003 at E3 on stage, jumping ahead of Nintendo for their next handheld announcement. Sony seemed to have a clear objective throughout its young history in gaming, which was take as much market share from Nintendo as possible. The funny part about the situation is Sony wasn't even supposed to be part of this gaming market, and their entry dates back to Nintendo backing out of an agreement in 1991 for a CD attachment that would work with the Super Nintendo, but that's a story for another day. Oh, quick side note, did you know that Sony wasn't even interested in making games for the CD attachment? They mostly wanted to make things like interactive encyclopedias, which what a world that would have been. The PSP is seen as Sony's first handheld related to gaming. However, they actually created a smaller handheld device to work with their PlayStation called the Pocket Station. This system was fairly limited in what it could do and was only ever released in Japan. It was released in 1999 and acted more like a memory card for the PlayStation that had some added features like a Tamagotchi companion and the ability to play extra minigames that were built into PS1 games at the time. There were allegations of plagiarism towards Sony when they announced it after the VMU from Sega. However, it was revealed only a few months after the VMU was released, and being able to design and manufacture the device in just a few months would have been nearly impossible. While the Pocket Station didn't find overwhelming success and was only ever released in Japan, it gave Sony some experience in the design and manufacturing process for a dedicated handheld device. The Pocket Station was a limited gaming device that was significantly weaker than the Game Boy Color even at the time. However, Sony was ready to do a complete 180 and blow everyone away with their next system. During the build-up to E3 2003, there were a lot of rumors going around about Sony entering the handheld market with their own offering. At this time, there was no competition for Nintendo's Game Boy line, and the Game Boy Advance was on cruise control. Sony's plan was to bring console-quality gaming experiences to gamers on the go, and to do this, they needed a system that was powerful enough to accomplish visual fidelity that was thought to only be possible when tethered to a wall. Finally, when E3 2003 happened, Sony showed up and announced the PlayStation Portable. Now, during this presentation at E3, they also revealed the storage medium that would be used for the PSP, the UMD, or Universal Media Disc. This small disc, encased in plastic, was capable of holding 1.8 gigabytes of storage on a dual-layer disc. That's actually more than the 1.5 gigabytes that the GameCube could hold on its smaller mini DVDs, and significantly larger than what was offered on the Game Boy Advance and even the soon-to-release DS. The UMD also offered the ability to move entire movies to the PSP, and since Sony wanted to offer the PSP as a media device as well as gaming device, this made perfect sense. I remember seeing tons of movies released for the UMD format, however, I never found watching movies on the PSP to be that enjoyable with the size of the screen. Now, the UMD was certainly not perfect, and it came with plenty of drawbacks. Some of the biggest issues included loading times that were fairly long, as well as the plastic casing around the UMD being known to crack and separate. There was also the big problem of a mechanical drive being required to read the UMD. This left several moving parts that were added to the design of the PlayStation Portable. We'll look more into that a bit later in the video when we take the system apart. The following year, Sony released the PSP, starting with Japan in 2004 and then the US and other parts of the world in 2005. The PSP saw immediate sellouts with 200,000 units selling the first day in Japan, and the US saw even greater success with 500,000 units selling in just the first 2 days. The PSP fell behind the DS in terms of sales. However, as Sony's first shot at handheld market, they held steady throughout the generation with their sales despite missing a killer IP like a Pokemon.
These PSP games are the business, and I can't stand hearing these kids talking about some weak app on the phone.
The future seemed bright for the PSP after its initial launch. However, Sony would soon encounter an issue they were not expecting, one that would become a thorn in Sony's side for the rest of the generation. In June of 2005, the PlayStation Portable was officially hacked. This allowed the system to begin running unsigned code that would allow users to create custom firmware as well as applications and homebrew. A programmer by the name of Dark Alex was infamous in the early days of the PSP hacking scene, as they provided cracks for firmwares that were released by Sony. In 2007, however, Dark Alex ended up resigning from the hacking scene, citing pressure from Sony. This would begin a constant back and forth between hackers and Sony for the rest of the PSP's life. As Sony released a new firmware, hackers would almost immediately crack it. Even after Dark Alex left the hacking scene, it only grew as more and more people began joining, which led to the biggest issue surrounding the PSP: piracy. As great as the custom firmware was for the PSP, as it opened up tons of options for the user base, I mean, look, someone even loaded up Windows 95, the entire Windows 95 experience on the PSP. Piracy quickly followed with dumps of entire games being shared online. It became a common practice for someone to buy a PSP just to hack it and not have to buy games. Despite this, in 2011, it was reported the PSP had sold 70 million units and 298 million pieces of software, giving the system a total of 4 titles per system. This would trail behind the DS that finished at 6 games per system and nearly 1 billion units of software. However, with Sony's struggles against piracy, this was actually a pretty good number to reach.
Alright, so now let's actually take a look around the system. The thing about the PSP that I really liked is it works well if you have like larger hands, because the screen is directly in the middle and you have the D-pad off to the left and then buttons off to the right with the shoulder buttons at the top. It's just an overall good feeling system. Sure, the little nub for an analog stick wasn't great, but it was the first time we had really seen that on a handheld like this, so it was pretty cool. On the back, we have our battery compartment, we have a memory card slot there, and at the top is where our UMD sits in. This is the 1000, so it's spring-loaded, whereas the other ones you'd actually have to kind of pop it open to get in there. I actually don't like the 1000 as much as the revisions, but still, this is kind of where it all started. It has 2 speakers, stereo speakers actually on the front, so it is quite loud. And then, of course, you can also plug it in through a headphone jack on the bottom here. Now, the screen itself, when it came out, very bright and everything. It did have some ghosting issues that they worked on as they went along with the revisions, but still, at the time, this was an awesome screen. So we're going to go ahead and take this guy apart, and to do that, we actually flip it over, and we have 4 of the Phillips head screws. So they didn't hit us with like tri-wing screws like we were dealing with Nintendo. Didn't have to deal with that, which was nice. So this actually comes apart very quickly with Phillips head screws here, and then some shorter ones, and then we also have one on the bottom there. So I'm gonna go ahead and get those out. Now once those screws come out on the bottom, this actually will just pretty much lift right off without any issues. The actual analog stick is replaceable right here as well. A lot of times you get this analog drift that takes place, and a lot of people will try to replace this piece right here, which is the full analog stick. However, you can actually end up sometimes having an issue here where there's this little rubber stopper here that actually does the connection for you. Sometimes that can actually be the issue, believe it or not, so you don't always have to replace that analog stick, so keep that in mind. Sometimes the connector here actually needs to be replaced, and it's just a little rubber strip that pops off and you put a new one down. Now the screen itself, again, was great at the time, and I look back on it now and it does have a lot of ghosting issues, but it was a 480 by 272 widescreen, so it worked really well for movies. Again, we talked about the UMDs. It actually worked really well for that. Even though I didn't like watching it on there, it at least had the right widescreen 16:9 format that it could accommodate those. These actually come right off, the shoulder buttons. They just pop right off. They're not even really sitting in there. And then once we get this guy off, we'll actually be looking at the board. Now, in order to reinforce this system, because there's a lot of plastic on the outside, they have this very large like metal shielding that goes throughout the middle of it between the screen and the board underneath. That kind of kept it from flexing too much, and also, of course, kept the screen strong on the underside, so it would also not flex much, because this is, while it is kind of thicker, especially when you get towards like the 2000 and the 3000, this screen becomes very thin. This still can flex and bend, and you don't want this LCD to do that, otherwise it'll crack. So we have a bunch of screws come out here, this will come out, and then we can actually get to the board, and we can get to the UMD drive. So this metal shielding comes off after removing all the different size screws, because they use just a ton of different size screws. The really cool thing about the PSP that I really liked at the time during repairs, it's a very modular system. So this is our D-pad over here. It actually just plugs in down here, and then it also has, as you can see, kind of the shoulder button at the top. So instead of having to get crazy and do some stuff like soldering and everything, you actually just replace this entire section by ordering the part online, and it just plugs in. so you don't have to do things like desolder, remove D-pads or anything. It's all like its own piece. Same with the A or the X, circle, triangle, square buttons over here, along with the charge port that plugs in. Everything pretty much plugs in, which made this way easier to repair, and I actually really like that. Obviously, the UMD also plugs in 2 different spots, here for the laser, down here for the motor. But overall, the only thing that was really annoying to have to replace in this system, outside of the UMD drive because of having to get to it and everything and not break the door on the back, was the USB port at the top. That was a pain as well. Otherwise, though, this is a pretty good system to repair. Okay, we now have our board out, and you can actually get a glimpse of the memory card slot down here, where that guy's plugged in, along with, this actually runs down there as well from the Wi-Fi on the side, but you can actually see where the memory card goes in there, and that actually sockets in to the back of the motherboard right there. So it's just a plug-in mechanism. And then we have our UMD back here that we'll pull out in a second so we can take a look at how that all works. But this is the actual PSP motherboard. It's not very large compared to the rest of the system. Most of it is pretty much just all chips, as you can see here. And we can actually take a quick look at the different chips, as well as a battery that they have soldered here just to kind of help with keeping the clock and everything. But let's take a look at these chips. Okay, so we're looking at a couple of different chips here. Now, you see 2 larger chips than a smaller one. The 2 larger ones are our 2 CPUs, MIPS-based CPUs. So we have the CXD2967GG. That is our main CPU core. It's generally clocked at 222 megahertz. However, it can go up to 333, and it was unlocked for a few games. Hackers even managed to unlock it completely, so you can just use it in emulation. The other chipset is a Media Engine CXD5026 chipset, and that is actually used to decode different video types like H.264. It was used for reading back UMDs that did use the different formats for movies and videos and everything, and they worked in tandem to do that, both CPU cores, but the Media Engine was there to kind of help out with H.264 decoding. The other chip is actually the RAM, so you have 32 megabytes of onboard memory for the system, which actually is the same as the PS2. One of the reasons it actually drew a lot of comparisons to the PS2 outside of how the visuals looked on the system was the fact that it basically had the same amount of system memory, and that of course got people talking. But the main thing about the PSP is it made visuals that were very impressive. It did have 2 megabytes of video RAM, so it had that stored for the CPU and the GPU that were on that same chip, and it did put out visuals that were pretty similar to the PS2. It of course helped that it was smaller on the screen, so it shrunk down and kind of hit a lot of issues that you would see otherwise on a big blown up screen. But the PSP was very impressive for its time, and it definitely used some serious hardware to get there. Now we're going to have to work our way in from the back here to get to the UMD drive. It's not too bad, but it's really annoying when you'd have to replace these and get everything back together correctly. That was the worst part. But this is our actual drive here. And what's interesting about this is it technically has everything that a full disk drive would have. Think about like on the PS2, or I guess even the GameCube or the Xbox at the time, and they managed to put it all into this very small, slim device. And it was kind of cool to see that. A lot of problems, obviously, a lot of moving parts here. You have your spindle that actually has to spin that UMD, and then you have your laser that actually has to move back and forth. You can kind of hear it and read that UMD. And then you, of course, have this arm that also is moving. Everything is kind of just trying to work together. You have a locking mechanism here, so when you put, this is Metal Gear Solid, so when you put it in, it would lock down. It would pretty much click in at the top, and now it's locked into where it could actually, this part would actually be spun by the spindle, and the laser would start to read. And it was an interesting idea at the time to be able to do that, but again, you can kind of see why they moved away from this going into the Vita. It was costly to create all of this, you know, and when you didn't have to do that, you just had a card you put in. So obviously there were some issues there when you created the system, and I think this is one of the big reasons why it was so pricey at the time compared to the DS. It's because like all of this was just more expensive than it should have been.
After the PSP finished up its time on the market, Sony introduced the Vita, which didn't go to plan. We'll take a look at the Vita in a later video, but it was pretty obvious that Sony became uninterested in the handheld market as time went on. Now it looks like Sony has all but forgotten about the dedicated handheld market, and with Nintendo now merging their home console and handheld divisions with the Switch, it seems Sony was correct to focus more on the PS4. No matter how people view the PSP, it's important to remember the impact of the PlayStation Portable in gaming. It provided more than smaller pick-up-and-play experiences that relied more on 2D adventures and pushed home console-level experiences into our pockets. the influence of the PSP is still felt to this day. I mean, Sony even introduced an official way to plug your PSP into your TV through AV or component cables. Seems kind of familiar now, right? And with the Nintendo Switch leveraging the idea with great success now, it shows just how far ahead of its time the PSP really was.